Hello, everybody. Once again, thank you for coming to the second breakout room. In this workshop, we have for you guys from Lucille and I, we have what the U.S. military doesn't want you to know about climate change. We have a wonderful presentation for you guys by our amazing guest speaker, Shea, but I will allow them to introduce themselves momentarily. Okay, so essentially what we're going to discuss here, just a few points. So one of the points is going to be the environmental impacts of the U.S. military. And then another point will be the climate impacts of the U.S. military as well. And then finally, we will talk about the historical overlaps between the climate justice and anti-militarism movement. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will address them after the presentation. But without further ado, I will kick it to Shea in just a second to introduce themselves and to begin presenting.
Thank you so much, Samir. Should I start sharing my presentation?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Okay, I'm gonna get that started. Sorry, it always takes me a moment. But while I'm doing that, hi everybody, it's really nice. I've met some of you, but for those I haven't met, it's really lovely to meet you. Sorry, I'm gonna stop this for a moment. My name is Shea. I am based here in Chicago. I'm an organizer with Code Pink. I work on the Divestment War Machine campaigns, where I get to work with folks in local cities and towns on divesting their communities from war and militarism, which is really exciting work and I love doing it. So let's see if I can figure out how to do this now. All right, can you all see a big screen that says what the US military doesn't want you to know about climate change? Great, thank you so much. Okay, so hi. Welcome to this session. I'm really grateful to be speaking. Like I mentioned, oh, it sounds like someone's a little loud. My name is Shea. I'm an organizer with Code Pink, and I'm based here in Chicago on the traditional homelands of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. So I get to work on divestment work, and what some of that looks like is I get to work on a local campaign here in Chicago to divest our public funds from war and militarism. So if you're interested in learning about that, I'm going to put the link in the chat where it is our main website. You can learn more about the work we're doing and get involved. Code Pink is a women-led grassroots organization working to end US wars and militarism, support peace and human rights initiatives, and redirect our tax dollars into healthcare, education, green jobs, and other life-affirming programs. Our tactics include direct action, challenging powerful decision makers in government and corporations. If you're interested in learning more, you can visit codepink.org. And I just want to flag that a lot of the work I'm going to be pulling from and graphics I'll be using in this presentation is from the National Priorities Project, which is a part of the Institute for Policy Studies that I got a chance to work with last summer. They do really great work. If you want to check it out, I'm going to put the link in the chat for them as well. Okay, so the first thing the US military doesn't want you to know about climate change is that they themselves are the single largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And I imagine a lot of you already know that, but it's really worth naming. Any conversation about the connection between climate change and militarism has to start with the elephant in the room, which is the Pentagon budget. Current levels of US military spending means that the United States now spends more than the next 11 nations combined. Even if we shaved $300 billion from our budget, we would still be spending more than the rest of the world combined. And taken in a historical context, this exceeds levels during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or the Reagan buildup in the 1980s, even adjusting for inflation. So we spend a pretty incredible amount of money. This excessive funding allows the US military to maintain and operate extensive infrastructure and operations, both domestically and abroad, making it not too difficult to be the biggest institutional consumer of oil and greenhouse gases in the world. The US military produces about 59 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually, which is more greenhouse gases than entire industrialized nations such as Sweden, Denmark, and Portugal. Sorry, this is a little low res, I realize, but I am pulling up a graphic from the great David Vine here, who is kind of the authority on tracking US military bases across the world, because the US military doesn't really want us to know how many there are. Why is the military so carbon intensive? It is because the military's sheer sprawl requires carbon intensive infrastructure and fuel consuming equipment. There are an estimated 800 plus military bases in 90 countries and territories across the globe, which we'll dig into a little bit more in a moment, but the carbon footprint associated with maintaining these bases is significant. These bases include airports, ports for boats, nuclear weapons facilities, and doesn't even include housing and other facilities for those living on the bases. So that is a massive source of carbon. Not to mention the fact that warfare in itself is extremely carbon intensive. Military operations account for 70% of the US military's energy consumption. Just one of the military jets, the B-52 Stratofortress, which is here, consumes about as much fuel in an hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years. This is the point where it should start becoming clear, and I'm sure a lot of you all are on the same page and I'm preaching to the choir here. But it's really clear that the fact is that the United States' narrative that individuals are responsible for climate change is a diversion and is completely inaccurate. Since the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the US military has emitted more than 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is the rough equivalent of the annual emissions of 257 million passenger cars, which is twice as many cars as there are on the road in the United States. We are being fed a lie when we are told that just by changing our personal habits, we can cut carbon emissions and save the planet. The US military's emissions will overshadow individual actions like that every time. So this brings us to part 2. The US military cannot be made green. It's inherently not possible. So now we're clear on the fact that the US military as it stands is not green at all. It's a massive consumer of fossil fuels, but can that be changed? I'm going to be talking about why not only can that not be changed, but it's besides the point. A lot of folks who are concerned about climate change may think that greening the military is key to a better future, but I think that is besides the point. I'm going to outline why. So reason number 1 why this is not possible is that the US military is one of their key functions is to secure and sustain natural resource extraction. So there is just the basic fact that the US military is largely mobilized to secure and sustain the extraction of fossil fuels and other forms of natural resources. We know a lot about this in terms of oil. It's becoming more and more true around cobalt, lithium, and other resources. The vast military infrastructure around the world is strategically positioned in oil and resource-rich regions and along shipping lanes that keep the fossil fuel economy in operations around the globe. Oil is the leading cause of war. An estimated 1/4 to 1/2 of all interstate wars since 1973 have been linked to oil. And there's a really famous quote that former CENTCOM commander General John Abizaid said about the Iraq War, which is that, of course, it's about oil. We can't really deny that. A lot of folks, after the fact have realized, have known that the Iraq War was fought for oil. But that is the case in a lot more instances than just Iraq. As groups such as Movement Generation have pointed out, the US military acts as the enforcement arm of American extractive capitalism. It uses its physical might to maintain access to natural resources and sustain the extractive industries that destabilize our planet. This is one of the key functions of the US military, and greening its fleet will not change that. And this is a side, but there are also certain parts of the US military fleet that cannot be made green. For example, there is no viable green high density jet fuel alternative that is currently in existence. So just want to put that out there as well. So we're revisiting this somewhat grainy image from David Vine. The US military, reason number 2 why, and I'm going into like sub reasons, so I hope that isn't too confusing, but why the US military cannot be made green is that it is a massive source of contamination due to its overwhelming global presence. As I mentioned earlier, the US maintains over 800 military bases around the world, and pollution, contamination, and other forms of environmental harm are found at nearly every base. A lot of folks know these stories, but I just want to lift up two examples. So the top left corner is a picture of open pit burning site in Iraq. Toxic munitions and the burning of military waste in Iraq contributed to widespread poisoning of the Iraqi environment that is linked to elevated rates of cancer and birth defects, which has been described as the highest rate of genetic damage to any population ever studied, which is pretty shocking. The picture in the top left corner is, like I said, an open burn pit, which is a way that US military bases have disposed of on-base waste, such as plastics, rubber, chemical mixtures, and medical waste. On one base, Joint Base Balad, a burn pit covered nearly 10 acres with the resulting smoke passing over the entire base as winds shifted. Massive surface area. Another important example in the bottom right corner is US military's extensive pollution of Okinawa, where the US maintains 31 military bases. Since the 50s, the US has wreaked environmental havoc there by shooting a nuclear rocket into a local harbor, losing a hydrogen bomb in nearby seas, and leaking a nerve agent on the island. And since 2016, which is, I think this is an example a lot more folks might be familiar with, the US has polluted the drinking water of 450,000 Okinawans due to their use of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, which are used and found on many other military bases across the world, including in the United States. There is a really vibrant protest movement against US military presence, contamination, and other impacts of militarism in Okinawa, which is what this picture is of, and is also really good to be uplifting. So another reason the US military inherently cannot be made sustainable is that it necessarily pulls substantial resources away from programs and resources for climate action and sustainability. The military budget in 2020 was 272 times larger than the federal budget for energy efficiency and renewable energy. Spending $740 billion on the Pentagon budget, or the Pentagon budget that Biden just proposed last week, $813 billion, means that we are pulling money away from projects and resources that might be able to address the global climate crisis. This money that is going towards war deprives us of resources, both in money and in terms of workforce, that could go to green energy, climate action programs, environmental justice cleanup funds, and beyond. For example, just 10% of the Pentagon budget in 2020, which was $74 billion, could have produced enough wind and solar power to power at least 187 million households in the United States. And that money going towards militarism instead of climate action is a huge loss. Finally, applying languages of greening the US military functions as greenwashing, and to my mind is besides the point. Covering up human rights abuses, racism, imperialism, and militarized violence with a facade of sustainability wipes the United States military's slate clean and gives them a free pass to continue oppressing the planet and the people across it. For those of us who are committed to building a just, sustainable future, an environmentally sustainable US military would still not be acceptable, even if all of these other issues were somehow addressed. It would still function to occupy, kill, and destroy communities across the world, and that's just something that cannot continue. So this brings us to part 3 of what the United States military doesn't want you to know about climate change, which is that there is a rich history of anti-militarist and climate justice organizing that is linked together, and our future relies on these two movements working together once again. There is a precedent set for moving money away from militarism and towards green jobs, which is rooted in the United States post-Cold War era. As the Cold War was winding down and Clinton was taking office in 1992, defense sectors were becoming the largest group displaced from US private industry over the past decade. 1.4 million workers in the sector lost their jobs between 1987 and 1996, which is really staggering. The peace movement developed a framework for how to deal with this, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. I think this is something that was really striking to me because I entered the peace movement early, more recently. I'm younger and didn't receive this history. So for some people, this might be old news. For some people, it might be new, but it's really energizing to me. The peace movement developed a framework for how to deal with this mass displacement of defense workers, coming up with the economic conversion movement, which aimed to convert jobs away from the permanent war economy and towards life-giving and life-affirming services, especially focusing on sustainable jobs. A campaign that arose out of this movement was the Jobs with Peace campaign, which aimed to shift federal spending away from the military and towards supporting communities and creating local jobs. From this local pressure, the federal government responded, and I think it's always important to think about what people and movements did to make the federal government act in justice-oriented or benevolent ways. Clinton vowed that the post-Cold War Pentagon budget would be reduced due to less military needs, and we would be able to cash in on a peace dividend. He said that the savings from the military budget would go towards revamping public infrastructure and training and moving workers away from the military industry. The Department of Labor developed various programs meant to fund the transition of these displaced defense workers, which included the Defense Reinvestment and Conversion Initiative, with funding amounting to $16.5 billion between 1993 and 1997. A program that came out of the Defense Reinvestment and Conversion Initiative was CalSTART, which was developed in California. Stipends were given to companies working on developing electric vehicles, with a preference given to former defense companies. The government was supporting this transition from militarism to climate action due to public pressure and movements. Unfortunately, there wasn't strong enough infrastructure to hold Clinton to his word, and the federal officials overseeing this economic transition chose to manage defense drawdown in a way that prioritized defense company managers and their bottom line instead of workers. But this example, I think, really shows us of economic conversion and peace dividend that peace and climate justice movements working together were able to push the federal government to move money away from the military and towards green jobs. And I think this sowed some really valuable seeds. So what would an anti-war climate justice oriented organizing strategy for the future look like now? A lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Just Transition framework, which I have up on the screen. And I want to give major props to Movement Generation, who have done a lot of really valuable work around just transition and created this graphic. And just transition acts as a roadmap for how we can move from extractive economic systems to a regenerative economy, while making sure that we are repairing the harms caused by the extractive economy and building a world where all people can thrive in a sustainable manner, including workers who were previously employed and harmed by extractive economies. This framework is being used brilliantly by the climate justice movement today to conceptualize how to move fossil fuel workers out of extractive industries and into renewables while maintaining good wages and union jobs. But something a lot of people don't know about Just Transition is that it was originally conceived of for workers in fossil fuel, chemical, and nuclear industries by Tony Mazzocchi, who is a leader of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, representing workers in the fossil fuel, nuclear, and chemical industries. He was working on this in the early 90s, right around when peace dividends and economic conversions were being sorted out. And he knew that both the science that was coming out linking fossil fuels to climate change and the post-Cold War drawdown was going to result in an increase in unemployment in his field. Referencing the economic conversion movement that we were just talking about, Mazzocchi coined the idea of a just transition, which he initially called a super fund for workers in the 90s, where financial and educational support would be given to workers impacted by their projects being closed down. The Just Transition Alliance formed in 1997 with organized labor and frontline communities meeting to discuss what a just transition looked like. And they were largely discussing it in the climate context, which is largely where this framework has remained to this day. The Just Transition framework is not widely referenced in the US anti-war movement today, but I think there is a lot that we can be learning from it. So a lot of you probably know the United States Department of Defense is the largest employer in the United States, with 200.91 million personnel employed and about 1.35 million people in the active duty military, which doesn't even account for the number of folks who are employed in private defense, contractor industries, which are largely subsidized by the federal government. So we know that pulling money away from the United States military, which is essentially what I'm advocating for, would result in a loss of jobs for these folks, which is not justice aligned and is not the direction we want to be headed in. What if we took the instructions from the economic conversion movement and Tony Mazzocchi's early just transition framework and started focusing on the possibilities of life and moving workers away from militarism and industries of death and towards sustainability, life, and green jobs? The table up here comes out of the University of Massachusetts Political and Economic Research Institute, or PERI, where they've done some really excellent research on the possibilities of moving workers out of the defense industry and into green jobs. I would especially recommend looking into Heidi Peltier and Miriam Pemberton's work, because they're really focusing on this, and that's where this table comes from. But it just demonstrates that there are transferable skills. Folks who are employed in making tanks, for example, can help make solar power retrofitted automobiles. These are really smart folks who know how to do this sort of work. And it's less an issue of having people that have no skills and more an issue of having the political will to train folks up, provide infrastructure, and transferring them to different industries and moving the money there as well. There is a lot of work that needs to be done, and I know that there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be created to hold the federal government accountable to legitimately caring about workers and committing to this transition. But I think the history of cross-movement organizing between anti-war and environmental work and this overlap of skills demonstrates that this is a really viable strategy, and there is a future where war and extraction is not the only place where folks can get good paying union jobs. And this is something that folks are even calling for today. This is a really great article that was published late last year by David Story in The Nation. I'm going to post a link in the chat for it. That highlights how we need good green union jobs over military jobs, and people already know that, so there's political will there. So the United States military doesn't want us to know a lot of things, because I've been talking for a long time and that seems to be the bottom line. Talked about the fact the United States military is not green. In fact, it's the biggest institutional producer of greenhouse gases in the world and institutional consumer of oil. I've also talked about how it inherently cannot be made green because it acts to access and sustain extractive resources. It's a huge source of contamination and pollution wherever its bases are and wherever it's conducting in warfare. And it pulls money away from climate action in our federal budget. I also talked about the fact that there is groundwork that has been laid for us in anti-war climate justice organizing that works to build a demilitarized green future. So of course, the United States military doesn't want us to know this, because with all of this in mind, we know that pulling money out of the Pentagon and moving workers away from the defense industry is our only shot at a just and livable future. We know that true climate solutions must have anti-militarism at their core, and joining folks together from different movements and workers together from different fields will bring together a huge mass of people who all have a vested interest in defunding militarism and funding livable futures. And the United States military cannot have us realizing that, because people and movements have a lot more power than they often think. So that's my presentation. We'll be doing a Q&A, which I'm really looking forward to. But if folks have ideas, issues, questions, anything like that, please email me. I'm Shea@codepink.org. And I really appreciate everybody listening to me.
Yes, Shea, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really informative, and it was really great to hear everything that you had to say. Now we're going to open up the floor to anybody if they have any questions that they'd like to ask Shea. Feel free to put them in the chat, or you can just unmute and talk.
Bernie, I think, has a question.
Two things. There's a lot of information just thrown at us, and I'm aware of some of it. But does the Code Pink website have duplicates of the presentation? The second point I want to point out, she did not mention space and Space Force, and that is huge. And I recommend that be brought into this kind of a presentation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Bernie. I think it's a really good flag around space. And to be completely honest with you, that's still an area that I am learning more about. I think a lot of my work is focused on specific sites of militarism and weapons manufacturers. So there's still a lot I need to learn, but I think that's a really good flag and is something I should be incorporating into my analysis. And I see Ivy's message in the chat about Space Force getting $25 billion. It's a really important point. And then just really quickly to touch on this presentation, we don't have it posted on our site, but I would be really happy to send it to anyone who wants a copy. If you want to send me your email in the chat, I can send it your way after this.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just like to say that I think Bernie makes a really good point about the space program, because this is more militarization that they're planning on doing in space, which is not going to help us out at all.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Cindy. Thank you all for flagging that. It's a really important point.
It's really hidden and it's so big. It's down the road. It's not something, well, it's going to cover another 5 or so years. It's huge. Go to Bruce Gagnon's nuclear weapons in space, nuclear weapons and power in space. And there's great presentations that I've seen him make on that subject.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really, Bruce Gagnon is great. I need to be reading his work more. I appreciate that.
So I wanted to ask you, Shea, that you said you go into all kinds of communities to, help to demilitarize. What pushback are you getting, or are you finding that you're getting a lot of good reception?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cindy. I think divestment campaigns are a really interesting thing because we are largely working just among ourselves and with often like city council officials. So the pushback we get is largely administrative, and we can feel the resistance that folks have to implementing divestment resolutions or ordinances just through like bureaucratic slowness or difficulty. I think if we were doing more on the street work, or when campaigns get to that point, you can feel pushback from more folks and different people with vested interest. But with divestment campaigns, I have often found, like with the city of Chicago, for example, we have been meeting with a lot of different aldermen, and we had a meeting last week that Samir was a part of, where an alder that we were talking with was concerned that we were trying to target too many weapons manufacturers, and was worried about us focusing on Boeing, for example, because as he said, they also just create airplanes. And so why would we want to be divesting from Boeing, because they create airplanes? And we know that that's kind of a diversion tactic, and that Boeing's work in the defense industry creating missiles and bombs overshadows their civilian aerospace program. But I think a lot of folks either don't know that or just feel concerned about being too radical and making a statement that their localities don't support war and militarism. And that's what the pushback often looks like.
Shea, are you familiar with the Lucas aircraft conversion project of the mid-70s in England?
I've read a bit about it, but Steve, would you want to discuss that a little
Well,
more?
I don't know too
Such
much
a good
about it.
example.
I just looked it up, but I want to know more. There were thousands of jobs in England, military jobs that they were threatening to cut, and the workers there, kind of from the bottom up, created all kinds of plans to convert the production to hybrid cars, to wind turbines, to heat pumps and stuff like that. And eventually they got shot down, but it was a very ambitious plan. I'll put a thing in the chat about it, a link.
Yeah, thank you for that example. That's such a good one. I think it's really interesting too, because they were really ahead of their time, and it was the workers who took the initiative to write up this proposal for transitioning the plant's production. Yeah, I want to be learning more about that. I think that's a really good flag, Steve. I appreciate that.
Shea, I was wondering if you by any chance could possibly talk a little bit more about your divestment campaign, just kind of like, how it kind of started, where you're at with it, things like that.
Yeah, thank you. I love talking about divestment campaigns, and specifically Chicago. There has been a lot happening recently. Of course, there's so much happening in the city, but the Divest Chicago from the War Machine campaign started up, I think, around 2015, where a group of local activists had gotten wind of the, Municipal Employees Annuities and Benefits Fund, or MABF, their investments in different sort of harmful industries. And we're really interested in looking to see if the MABF was invested in weapons manufacturers like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and beyond. And they started up a pretty lengthy process of just trying to get the investment portfolio and get the city's investment policies and information. And I think that they were pushed away for a really long time, I think maybe upwards of a year. They tried to get in touch with the treasurer. The treasurer told them they didn't have that information. They filed a Freedom of Information Act request. That was turned away, which is, I don't think, legal. And then finally, I think they filed another FOIA and got the investment info. And it turns out that the city, not to get too into the weeds, but the city just has this large pot of money and they give different chunks of it to asset managers. And those asset managers invested in different companies. And we found out that they were invested in pretty substantial defense industry companies, including companies that make nuclear weapons. And this was all kind of hidden away. And we think very possibly a lot of city officials don't know that these investments exist because there's a lot of just confusing language or shifting blame, saying, we're not doing the investing, our asset managers are, even though it's our money, it's our public funds. So anyway, folks in Divest Chicago drafted up a open letter, which turned into a resolution saying, we are calling on the MABF and other city funds to divest their funds from weapons manufacturers and not make any such investments in the future. We got to working with Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who is really great. He introduced that resolution to City Council last November, and it got transferred to a committee. And then the last January, it got transferred to another committee. And we are currently at a point where we're coming up against a little bit of red tape, trying to get it up for a hearing. And there's always so much going on in City Council, but there's been a lot of slowness on it, and it's in the Committee on Finances. So there's a lot happening there as well. We're currently in a point where we're setting up a lot of meetings with different alders, trying to also meet with the treasurer, just talking to folks about why we're trying to do what we're doing, why we think it's aligned with the city of Chicago's values to move our money away from militarism and towards peace. And hopefully we'll be moving forward with that. And if people are interested in joining our next meeting, which is not this week, but the week following, I think on Wednesday evening, they're welcome to join. And also, if you're interested in talking to your alderman about this or joining any of our other alder meetings, you're really welcome to. I'll put my email in the chat again. And I see some people are sending me their emails about the presentation. But let me know if you want to get involved. We are always really excited to have new folks, and we're always trying to adapt our strategy. And I think ultimately our vision is to be just connecting to the larger anti-war movement here in Chicago, and not just divest our funds, but also support organizing to end the 1033 program in Chicago, which is a program by which the US military gives our police military grade weapons for free. We want to end that. We want to end the city of Chicago's support of Boeing, which is headquartered here. There's a lot of militarism, and we know that investments aren't the limit to that, but we do think this is a really important step and a commitment that the city could very, very feasibly make with no economic risk. So we're trying to make that happen.
I just wanted to actually address Libby's request. Actually, there is a I can actually send this to you right now, but there is an Instagram called Boeing Arms Genocide, and they work very closely with essentially like kind of like divestment stuff with centered at Boeing, and they actually have a link that I will put in the chat in just a second of ways of how to get involved with them beyond like their list. So I'll send that in just a second.
Yeah. And I also want to uplift, I've gotten to be a part of the campaign that Samir was talking about against Boeing, and we just had a really substantial win, which is super exciting. The campaign is called Boeing Arms Genocide. It's being led by Dissenters with it, which is a youth anti-imperialist, anti-war movement. And we have been working to end Boeing's contract with the city of Chicago, which started in 2003. We have given them $61 million to stay headquartered here and to provide us with like 600 white collar jobs in the loop. We don't know why they did this. This is not providing manufacturing jobs for everyday Chicagoans. It's just, I don't know, some scheme to make Chicago look more interesting as a tech city, as a corporate friendly city. Anyway, we requested an investigation through the Office of the Inspector General last year, and we filed some Freedom of Information Act requests. And through all of this and kind of putting Boeing on the spot and showing them that young people were looking at what they were doing and they couldn't just fly under the radar, we actually got word that not only was Boeing's contract ending with the city of Chicago this year, we learned that they rejected their entire year of payments from last year. We think because they were not fulfilling all of the terms of their contract and they were nervous about putting the city in a bad position. And in our FOIA documents that we received, we saw an email thread from city officials who are in charge of Boeing's contract saying, yeah, Boeing is doing us a solid, like this investigation isn't great. They're rejecting the last payment. So that's a huge win. And that just shows you what happens when people organize and when people hold these defense contractors accountable. And that doesn't always happen. So when it does, it's really impactful. And I just want to celebrate that campaign. It's really cool stuff. Yeah, Ivy.
I want to hear anything that you or Samir have to say about the military and these firms either recruiting or having propaganda on college campuses.
Yeah, actually. So last year, my school, I wasn't involved because I was back home due to COVID, but essentially a lot of organizations at DePaul, such as Dissenters, SJP, which is Students for Justice in Palestine, and then CAPA as well, some other organizations, DePaul Socialists, but basically a bunch of orgs at DePaul got together and they started a divestment campaign because there's a lot of evidence and pointing towards like DePaul's board members and that hint at that they're possibly investing in weapons companies, a lot of which help with Israel's occupation of Palestine. And I'm not gonna lie, it's been a struggle to, kind of succeed in our plan because DePaul is very, very secretive with their investment portfolio. And unfortunately too, the campaign we had kind of fell through last year. We're trying to get it started up this year. We're kind of in the building blocks of it right now. SJP DePaul actually they just released a statement to DePaul regarding their demands for divestment, such as giving Palestinian students more representation, obviously, and then the main one is to get their investment portfolio released. But it's been a challenge for sure, but we're working towards it. Andy, if you had your hand raised.
Just real quick, Samir, you raise a really important issue way back in the 20th century when I was in school. I mean, way back. One of the things we did in the anti-apartheid movement was to study all the different boards that the board members of the university were on, what corporate boards they were on, what corporate jobs they had. And we found that 2/3 of the board members were also on the boards of corporations that did business in South Africa. And then when they set up a committee to study the issue of divestment, they packed it with 3/4 of those same people. And it's a really good way to point out, these people are not listening to us. They're not on our side. They're actually on the other side and they're profiting from the things that they say they oppose. So we just found this by going to the university archives department. Because it was a private university, a lot of this stuff is more difficult. Now we're in the age of the internet and you can find out that information, but finding out what ties these jerks have really can back them into a corner about all their talking points about being concerned about justice and the rest of it. Thanks.
That's such a good point, Andy. And I've been thinking about this recently just because I think since the since the war in Ukraine started, it's come to a lot of people's attention that a lot of politicians and members of Congress who are on strategic committees, like the Committee on Appropriations, Committee on Defense, own stock in defense companies that they are giving more money to. They're passing emergency bills saying we need to up the Pentagon budget so we can give more contracts to these companies so they can send more warplanes. And they own stock in those companies, so they're making more money, and that is perfectly legal. So whether it's on the board member at our universities or whether it's within the federal government, yeah, people like they have financial interest. And we always need to be exposing that and thinking about that, because we know we're on the right side of history. We know we're doing the thing that values life and communities. And even if people say that they agree, when their finances or their investments say differently, that needs to be exposed, because that's just not right.
Yeah, I just want to say that it should not be legal. It should be an ethics law saying that if you own stock in a corporation, if a member of Congress or the Senate owns stock in a corporation, number one, they have to disclose it, and number two, if a bill comes up that includes that corporation, if a bill of expenditure appropriation comes up that involves that corporation that they own stock in, they have to recuse themselves from the vote.
Completely agree.
Yeah. I mean there are all kinds of conflicts of interest. I mean, there are all kinds of conflicts of interest going on in Washington, and probably in Springfield for that matter.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to even bring up too, DePaul in particular is such like a big hypocrite when it comes to like divestment, because DePaul has this thing called like Vincentian values, basically, which is like basically it's all about like respect and equality for everybody and fair treatment of everybody on campus. But yet here we have like all this evidence pointing towards their investment in weapons companies, especially, investments that go towards Israel's occupation of Palestine. Like it's just so like, it's so hypocritical. That's why we're working really hard to try to get their investment portfolio released. But they're super secretive about it. And, they use this whole Vincentian ideology to kind of cover their tracks and as like a shield. It's really frustrating. But it looks like we've got about, Andy, you have something to say?
Just using their own words against them, Samir. It's great that they're lauding these Vincentian values. I mean, it's perfect fodder. I mean, looking at, any corporation's value statements or something, I mean, yeah, our eyes glaze over that when we read it because we know it's a bunch of BS, but using it in your literature against them, it's perfect stuff.
Exactly. But I think we have about like a minute or two, if I'm not mistaken. So we should be closing out here momentarily. If anybody has any last minute comments or questions, feel free to ask them. We haven't closed out just yet. But yeah, I just want to let you guys know that. But thank you again for everyone for being here. Really appreciate you guys taking your time to be a part of this workshop and just a part of this Peace Summit in general.
Shay, thank you so much. Excellent presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all listening and contributing your ideas and thoughts. It feels great to be talking about.